I'm Sharmita Lahiri from IIT Gandhinagar, and my paper is entitled India Through Different Lenses, a study of Rushdie's Midnight's Children and Tagore's The Home and the World. Critical discourse has distinguished Indian writing in English and regional language Indian literature in terms of a basic dichotomy of intentions. The former's aim at having a conversation with the world, and the latter's concentration on specific local situations. Salman Rushdie dismissed regional language writings from the canon of post-colonial Indian literature on charges of parochialism and backwardness of regional literature, which, in his opinion, make this literature incapable of a conversation with the world. Countering Rushdie's charge, S. Shankar has claimed that the basis for Rushdie's biased exclusion of regional language writings from the canon of post-colonial Indian literature is the Western Academy's tendency of privileging transnational post-colonialism, which aims at a conversation with the world, over vernacular post-colonialism that concentrates on local concerns and issues. Rajeshwari Sundarajan has observed that while vernacular writers aim at a local audience familiar with the Indian circumstances, Indian writers writing in English, quote, are positioned to look in two different directions, towards their Indian readers on the one side and their readers in the West in another, end quote. Pankaj Mishra contends that what Rushdie calls a conversation with the world is actually a conversation with Europe and America, and thus has argued against considering literature that attempts to figure out the society from which it issues as parochial and inferior to the literature that can hold a conversation with the world. Rushdie, as well as the anti-Rushdie critics, thus demarcate Indian English literature and regional language Indian writings on the basis of their focus on a worldwide and local audience and their consequent articulation of a transnational and a vernacular sensibility. These have also been the criteria determining the reception of Indian writing in English and regional language Indian literature outside the country. Rushdie's novels, as Keith Booker comments, have, quote, widespread critical acceptance in the West as masterpieces of post-colonial or postmodern sophistication, end quote. In fact, Midnight's Children has been acclaimed by the New York Times as a continent finding its voice. In sharp contrast, despite Tagore being the first non-European to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913 for his collection of poems Gitanjali, which suggests he is more than a regional writer, writing in a regional language, his novels, as Michael Sprinker has pointed out, quote, have suffered in their Western reception for being suffused in the life world of Indian civilization, while not appearing sufficiently exotic to Westerners, who are inclined to want Eastern mysticism from such figures as Tagore, end quote. This essay, through a comparative study of Rushdie's Midnight's Children and Tagore's The Home and the World, originally written in Bengali, highlights the disparities between Indian writing in English and regional language literature that critics have drawn attention to. The distinct intentions and visions that characterize Midnight's Children and The Home and the World, however, do not accord superiority to one novel over the other, but indicate that they are varied but equally credible voices of a diverse nation. Although The Home and the World and Midnight's Children are separated by a span of 66 years and belong to British and independent India respectively, these two novels emblematize the cosmopolitan local dichotomy between Indian English and regional language Indian literature that critical studies have highlighted. This, and not chronology, the traditional historical read, has been the governing principle for this comparative study of the two texts. In The Home and the World, Tagore questions the ideology and the practices of a particular anti-British movement of Bengal, the Swadeshi movement. Familiarity with the history and the socio-cultural milieu of Bengal of the time period depicted, and Tagore's own standing on socio-political questions explored in the novel are prerequisites for understanding the work. Furthermore, a sensibility rooted in Bengali culture articulated in the work makes it less accessible to an international audience. Concentration on the local, however, does not in any way erode the merit of The Home in the World. The novel is a brilliant examination of the different aspects of the discourse of anti-British nationalism as embodied in the Swadeshi movement. Tagore was initially one of the pioneers of the movement. However, by 1906, he had begun to be disillusioned by the extremist overtones that the movement was acquiring, as it was being transformed into a full-scale resistance movement against the British government. After the summer of 1906, he withdrew from the movement. Tagore's withdrawal from the movement was severely criticized. The Home in the World can be considered as Tagore's response to his critics. He had earlier, in 1908, defined his standpoint when he had argued in a letter, quote, "I will not buy glass for the price of diamonds, and I will never allow patriotism to triumph over humanity as long as I live," end quote. In The Home in the World, claims Ronajit Guha, Tagore projects his personal preoccupation with the individual's freedom to choose his own way of serving the cause of social and political emancipation. Tagore's exposition of the darker sides of the Swadeshi movement is rendered convincing by his investment in the issue through characters. We perceive the events and their consequences through the eyes of the morally upright Nikhilesh, the dubious Shondip, and the misled Bimala, all three of whom are narrators in the novel. The same situations and events are thus often projected from three different angles of vision, which highlight their multiple dimensions to the reader. As the narrative of Bimala, Nikhilesh, and Shondip reveal their thought processes, they come across as convincing human beings caught in a whirlpool of emotions, desires, and principles. Nikhilesh is the Tagorean thinker, embodying Tagore's humanitarian principles. The assertion that Nikhilesh is the unreconstructed voice of Tagore's political views in the novel may be regarded as problematic. This assertion is, however, justified given the fact that The Home in the World can be considered as Tagore's answer to criticism against his withdrawal from the Swadeshi movement, and the ideas and political standpoint articulated by Nikhilesh have been repeatedly voiced by Tagore himself in his responses, lectures, essays, and even songs and poems. The argument that Tagore makes in his 1908 letter is echoed in Nikhilesh's declaration, quote, "I am willing to serve my country, but worship I reserve for the right, which is far greater than my country," unquote. Among the protagonists of Tagore's novels, Nikhilesh mirrors most closely Tagore's own aristocratic social position as well as spiritual ideals. Nikhilesh's commitment to humanist values and his consequent opposition to the Swadeshi movement for its propagation of destruction and use of coercion to compel to submission those opposed to it alienates him from the mainstream thought of the time and also from his wife Bimala, who begins to ardently endorse those thoughts. Tagore remained opposed to ideals that subordinated the individual to the collective. To Nikhilesh, attempts to force the poor Muslim traders to identify with the cause which entails economic sufferings for them are unjust. Nikhilesh denounces revolutionary terrorism practiced by the Swadeshis as a psychological legacy of colonial domination. Tagore reiterates this thought in his essay, Nationalism in India, where he states that the goals of the extremists were, quote, "based on Western history," unquote. The kind of nationalism that Nikhilesh opposes is essentially destructive in nature. He has been a pioneer of Swadeshi much before the concept had been popularized. He had been engaged in what can be defined as constructive Swadeshi, as opposed to Shondip's destructive Swadeshi. As Indrani Mitra points out, Tagore himself adhered to the philosophy of constructive Swadeshi. However, Nikhilesh's constructive Swadeshi, and by extension Tagore's constructive Swadeshi, devoid of inflammatory rhetoric and paraphernalia, remained unappreciated. Critical studies have claimed that what made Tagore and his protagonist Nikhilesh's pursuit of constructive Swadeshi possible was their aristocratic class position. The last representative of an aristocratic family, Nikhilesh is the preserver of the order and stability of home. Home for him is not just his mansion, but his entire estate. The threat to the social order represented by Nikhilesh is posed not by the masses, but by self-appointed bourgeois representative of the masses like Shondeep and his followers. Swadeshi intrudes into Nikhilesh's mansion and his estate in the form of Shondeep. Contrary to Nikhilesh, the preserver, Shondeep is the agent of change. Shondeep, however, does not simply represent Nikhilesh's opposite ideology, a different version of patriotism or communalism as opposed to Nikhilesh's secularism. He is a character with distinct negative traits. Critics have differed in their interpretation of Shondeep. According to Ghosh and Sharkar, he is the fiery, passionate John Juan, the opposite of Nikhilesh, the calm rationalist. Sprinkler argues that Shondeep is intended to represent the Nietzschean Superman, the transvaluer of all values. I, however, argue that since in The Home and the World, Tagore intended not only to investigate conflicting nationalist discourses, but also to highlight the negative impact of the Swadeshi movement, Shondeep is projected as the worst kind of nationalist leader. By the third part of the novel, he is no more than a scheming villain. In The Home and the World, the tumult created by the Swadeshi movement jeopardizes the order of Nikhilesh's estate and also taints the honor of his family through the seduction of Bimala by Shondeep. Tagore's depiction of Bimala intertwines the nationalist question with the women's question. Partha Chatterjee suggests that the discourse of nationalism was essentially gendered in nature. It identified women as representatives of the space of home, the last citadel of traditional values. The Home and the World illustrates the harsh consequences of a woman's inability to effectively negotiate the transition from the tradition of home to the modernity of the world. The denouement of Bimala's failure to temper the world with the spirituality of the home and instead allowing the duality of the two realms to collapse is the loss of her surrogate son Amullo, the impending death of her husband. Bimala's predicament hints at the inability of the nationalist discourse to provide an answer to the women's question beyond its defined parameters. Tagore had been concerned with the women's question since his 1910 novel Gora, and he resolved it for himself by unequivocally prescribing a traditional role for women in Charodhai, published in 1934. The Home and the World seems to affirm Tagore's faith in 19th century male reformism and marks a movement towards his endorsement of a partially reformed traditional role for women in Charodhai. As the discussion reflects, like most regional language writings, The Home and the World mandates an awareness of the historical backdrop of the period depicted and contemporary socio-political discourses along with the author's standpoint of them, especially on nationalism and the women's question. The novel also makes references to a variety of Bengali Hindu cultural markers, some of which are explained in the English translation through footnotes. It is thus obvious that the novel presupposes an audience from Bengal in particular and India in general. In contrast to such an orientation, Midnight's Children, with its stroke of hybridity, attempted reproducing the plurality of India and creating a national allegory is aimed at a transnational readership. With an orientation sharply divergent from The Home and the World, Midnight's Children endorses the cosmopolitan local binary, which critical discourse has identified as constituting the principal distinction between Indian English literature and regional language writings.